Hi, Bill here. I'd like to talk about pawn structure. Pawns are the only units that cannot move backwards. Pawns cannot move off a file unless they make a capture. Some pawns may not move for many moves, while one pawn move may not alter the position much. Good pawn. A good pawn is a pawn which is defended or can be defended by another pawn. Okay, so in this position all the pawns are good. A weak pawn is a pawn which cannot be easily defended by another pawn. That means if the pawn is attacked, it must be defended by a piece or pieces, which means that piece will be tied down. There are different types of weak pawns. One is the isolated pawn. So A2 is isolated. Isolated pawn is a pawn that has no friendly pawns on adjacent files. These pawns here on G2 and G3 are doubled and isolated. There are no pawns on adjacent files which might defend them. So they're double isolated pawns. This pawn on C3 is a backward pawn. It cannot be defended from behind. There's no pawn that could move to defend it. And the square in front of it is controlled by black. So these are weak pawns. That's not a weak pawn. Okay, so isolated pawn. This has no friendly pawns on adjacent files. And sometimes called an isolani. And the square and all the squares, in fact, in front of an isolated pawn are weak, which means weak simply means those squares can never be controlled by a white pawn unless there's a change in pawn structure. And a weak square for one side is a strong square for the other side. So white's got an isolated queen pawn. Isolated pawn on an open file. So this is an isolated pawn not on an open file. This pawn is a backward pawn on an open file. So that's tends to be weaker because it can be attacked with rooks and queens down the file. Double pawns. Double pawns are when you have two pawns on the same file, two friendly pawns on the same file. The main problem with them is they're just a bit clumsy when you advance them because the front one blocks the back one. You want to distinguish between double pawns and double pawns which are isolated as well, which tend to be quite weak if they're doubled and isolated. Occasionally you get triple pawns. You don't get them that often because you've got to make, let's see, you've got to make 1, 2, 3 pawn captures or captures with pawns to get this position. So triple pawns aren't that common. So I did see a game once by Allerheim where he had quadruple pawns. He had 4 pawns on a file, which is very rare. Okay, triple pawns are like doubled isolated pawns, but even worse. If they're isolated, that is. Okay, so backward pawns. So pawn on E3 defends D4. Pawn on D5 defends E4. These two pawns are pretty strong, but these are backward. They can never be defended by a friendly pawn, so they are a weakness. And backward pawns tend to be weaker on an open file because they can be hit at by rooks and queens on the open file. Sometimes even in the king and pawn ending, the king can come in and exploit that empty square. Okay, so a weak square. So a weak square is any square that can never be defended by a pawn. So it doesn't apply to the first two ranks of one side because those two ranks can never be defended by pawns. But in this position, because of the white pawn moves, none of these squares can ever be defended by a white pawn regardless of what white does. So that's the technical meaning of a weak square, a square that can never be guarded by a pawn, and a weak square for one side is a strong square for the other side. Okay, so now we've got hanging pawns. So hanging pawns, well, they're not quite weak pawns. They can't be guarded by a pawn unless they advance. If one advances, the other one turns into a backward pawn. So they've got pros and cons. They do guard lots of squares. They occupy space, but at the same time they can't be defended by a pawn unless they move themselves. Now you have something called an artificially isolated pawn. So even though the pawn on A5 does have a pawn on adjacent file, this will never go to B6 unless this pawn has been captured. The same token, this pawn on A4, there's no way white can get a pawn to defend it. So these in practice are isolated. So they're called artificially isolated pawns. Now, in this case, A4 is a artificially isolated pawn because if white ever plays B3 to defend it with a pawn, black will be able to take it. Even if white could retake with a piece, so it's just been exchanged, this will still be left isolated. Loose pawns. So some pawns aren't technically weak, but they still lost a bit of flexibility. So it often applies when you're moving pawns in front of the king. So by moving F3, it did weaken the E3 square, and this square's sort of been half weakened because now the H pawn moves, G3 will become weak. So pawn island. So pawn island is a group of pawns. Apparently the name was created by Capablanca. So there's one group of black pawns, so black has 2 pawn islands and white's got one group. Capablanca used to say 1 pawn island was best for drawing purposes and 2 pawn islands is best for winning purposes. So disconnected pawns. So here we've got 2 pawns on adjacent files, but they're a long way from each other. So it might be a little while before the white pawn can support this one. So they're disconnected by the rank rather than by the file. And now repairing pawns. So every time you move a pawn or you make a capture with a pawn or a pawn is captured, you change the pawn structure. So here white's got 2 isolated pawns, but when he takes a bishop, he repairs the pawns. 2 pawns become connected. So here white's got 2 isolated pawns, black's got 2 good pawns. So what white does is advance because he wants to exchange off his weak pawn for, and doesn't matter what black does when these exchange, what we have 1 isolated pawn against 1 isolated pawn, so black will gain an isolated pawn. So you can dissolve your weak pawns by exchanging them off. So in this position, white's got a backward pawn, so he moves it up and hopes to swap the pawn off. So pawn chain. So when you have pawns in a diagonal line, the back ones guard the front ones, and the back one is not defended. That's called the base of the chain. That's the front of the chain. So here we've got a longer chain, so 3 front ones are defended and the back one is not defended. So here we've got a double-headed chain, so 2 chains joining together. So there's 2 bases, both the bases are undefended by pawns. So here we've got a chain, so in this case black attacks the base of the chain from the front. So when white swaps off, unfortunately it means for black the square the white pawn was on is now a weak square for black. Black now has a backward pawn on the open file, and that's a strong square for white. When the pawn was there, white couldn't put a piece there. So now, this time, as a contrast, black attacks the chain from the base. So pawn moves up, he swaps off. So what that means is white hasn't gained a... Well, he's gained a strong square here to some extent, but he's left with a weak pawn here. So this time, black undermines the chain, but he can take back with a pawn. So what's happened is here, white now has an isolated pawn when it wasn't isolated before. So pawn wedge, if you can get a pawn on the e6 guarded by a pawn, can drive a wedge into your opponent's position. It controls a lot of space. In some cases, this setup would cut black's position in half, because it could be difficult to move pieces from the queen side to the king side. So phalanx. Phalanx is when pawns are side by side. They're strong, because all the squares in front of them are defended by pawns, and they can move and support each other. So a pass pawn, if there's no pawns that can potentially, that are in front of it, or on the adjacent files in front of it. So in this position, potentially the white pawn could go 1, 2, 3, 4 and promote, provided there are no black pawns in this area. So if black had a pawn there, maybe that's actually doesn't matter, because white can move on. A supported pass pawn is a pawn defended by another pawn, which is good. Often pass pawns are isolated, which means while they're strong, they are weak at the same time. They need to be defended by pieces. But having a pawn supported by another pawn means that pass pawn can be strong. The more advanced the supported pass pawn, the better. Okay, so here white's got a supported pass pawn, but black can undermine it by breaking up the defender. So he advances his own pawn, and if white takes, he takes this back, and he's broken up. He's won the pass pawn. So connected pass pawns, they can be good, because as they move, the other pawn, so white moves, now that square is not controlled, so it controls it with the other pawn. Now this one can advance, this one can move. So part of the time at least one pawn can support the other pawn. Distant pass pawns. So here the pawns are equal. Both sides have a pass pawn, but the white pawn is further away from the remaining pawn. So what will tend to happen is the white king will stop this one, the black king will stop this one. Both these pawns will be captured, but the white king will be closer to the remaining black pawns and will get to the king side before black gets to this side. So a distant pass pawn, which is also called an outside pass pawn or a remote pass pawn, can be a winning advantage. Pawn majority. So here white's got 2 to 1. So majority is just when you have more pawns than your opponent on one side of the board. So pawn majority, if it's effective, it means you can create a pass pawn. So here white just pushes, and he's got a pass pawn. Pawn exchange, and that pawn can queen. So here's a fairly common situation, which is worth knowing about. White's got a queenside pawn majority of 3 against 2. He's got to be careful how he advances these pawns. If he advances the wrong way, then 2 pawns will hold up 3. So the trick is to move the unopposed pawn first. So you move the c pawn. So if black does that, then you must go to a3. Now we'll have a look at that again. Okay, so here, white advances, black advances, white moves, must move the knight's pawn, black advances, white moves. Now say if black moves the king or some other piece, now white can advance the b pawn, and now white's ready to get a pass pawn. If we back up there, we notice that after a5, white has to be careful not to play a3, because black can play a4 and one pawn will hold 2. Okay, next position. So this time white's got a 3 to 2 majority, but the black is missing the a pawn, so the trick is to move the unopposed pawn first. So you move the a pawn. Let's say black does that. You must move the b pawn, not the c pawn. So black does that. Now you control the b4 square. So black moves his king, advances the b pawn. Let's say black moves his king or another piece, and then a5 creates the pass pawn. So the principle is advance the unopposed pawn. Now this time the middle pawn is missing, and the same rule still applies. So you move the unopposed pawn. So black does that. You move to control the b5 square. So you say black moves up his other pawn. This square is controlled twice. White moves up his third pawn to the 4th rack. So Black moves another piece, and then white can create his passed pawn. Okay, so now we have a 4-3 majority on the king side. So white advances the g pawn. Then black does something. Then white will advance the f pawn. Black does something. Then white can advance his e pawn. Now with double pawns, it makes it a bit more problematic. So the double pawns in this position delay the creation of a passed pawn by white. So this pawn can go here, this can go here, can move here, and to get a passed pawn, white does eventually have to sacrifice a pawn. Now, sometimes you have a pawn majority which is ineffective, which means maybe one will hold 2 pawns, maybe 2 will hold 3, maybe 3 will hold 4. So because white has a double pawn, this is a case of 3 holding 4. Okay, so here white has a good majority. It's going to advance safely. But here, one pawn holds 2. We're not too fussed though, because after we sacrifice the pawn, we're going to queen the a pawn quite fast, or it's very advanced. So this is going to depend on where other pieces are. Okay, so now white's got a majority of 4 against 3. Black has set up a defensive V. It doesn't matter what white does, he can exchange or push, he's not going to get through. It's very important that black does not exchange, which would undouble the pawns. Then white would then have an effective majority and white could get a passed pawn. Okay, so now we've got the formation from the Queen's Gambit, where white does the so-called minority attack. Usually it's usually easy to attack when you've got a pawn majority, but here white attacks, and the aim of this attack is to weaken the black pawns. So white advances a b pawn supported by the rook, keeps going, black stops it, white control b5, black starts his own minority attack, white pushes, pawns get exchanged, and now it doesn't, black continues. It wouldn't have helped if he exchanged, that would just weaken both these pawns. And now white could exchange pawns and saddle black with a backward pawn on the open file. So you can have the classic pawn centre where you have a phalanx of pawns in the centre. And that's the end of the section. So that was just an example of some key things about pawn structure, particularly weak pawns and weak squares, passed pawns and pawn majorities. Thank you for watching.